Good morning, everybody. Thanks for being here. We're actually going to start with Jim Gamble, the Executive Director of the Aleut International Association. He was actually going to be our keynote on Monday, and we wanted to give him a chance to share a little bit about the Arctic Council, AIA, and some other exciting initiatives.
Let me get started, and we've got a lot to cover and a lot of exciting things, and we'll just kind of dive right in. And just some quick words about AIA and who we are and where we come from. So we were founded in 1998, and it was because there was this new thing called the Arctic Council that was forming, and there was a real recognition that indigenous voices were being heard in this Arctic Council, and that Aleut voices were part of that mix and needed to be heard. And so AIA was formed in '98, just after the Arctic Council, and it was two organizations that did that. It was APIA and a kind of a related organization in the Kamchatka Peninsula that includes Aleut people of the Commander Islands of the Russian Federation. And so we're governed by kind of an interesting board that's composed of 4 Alaskan and 4 Russian Aleuts. And so our board meetings tend to be a lot like what you're experiencing right now. We tend to have a lot of teleconferences between the Russian and Alaskan sides. And so AIA's mandate really kind of falls into 3 main categories. And so, of course, a big part of what we do is establishing ties and maintaining connections between the Russian and Alaskan sides, and that involves a lot of work in culture and language. And then, of course, we also engage in these international activities, primarily through the Arctic Council, but also through other organizations that are involved in international work. And then, finally, we really try to promote community involvement in research, monitoring, assessment, all facets of work that happens in the Arctic. Now, this thing called the Arctic Council, I'm sure there's a lot of you in the audience that know a lot about it, so I apologize for kind of the simple explanation. But the Arctic Council was founded in 1996, and it was founded from some precursor organizations that were really looking at contamination in the Arctic and changes in the environment in the Arctic that were brought about not because of things that were happening there, but because of things that were happening elsewhere. And so when the Arctic Council was formed, it was recognized that in addition to the Arctic environment, there was a lot of things that the 8 Arctic states could get together to discuss in addition to just the environment. And so the Arctic Council was sort of a broadening of this environmental mandate. And so now it's really become the premier and most recognized forum for international cooperation in the Arctic. And of course, it's composed of the 8 member states that have territory above the Arctic Circle. Denmark is in there because of Greenland. And then the very unique thing about the Arctic Council is the inclusion of 6 organizations that represent the indigenous peoples of the Arctic, and Aleut International is one of those. The list you see on the screen is the 6 organizations, and 4 of those are bolded because those are all organizations that have at least part of their constituencies in Alaska. So Alaska, in terms of Arctic Council indigenous peoples, is really, really well represented at the Arctic Council, and this gives us some interesting opportunities. And then I'm going to give you a slide in just a second that shows the structure a bit more, but it's also interesting to note that there are 32, as of now, observer organizations and 10 countries in the Arctic Council, and 16 more applications pending. So we're going to be getting close to 50 observers, and that is a real indication of how much interest there is in the Arctic and in the Arctic Council itself. Next slide is the structure of the Arctic Council right now during the period we're in from 2015 to 2017, which is the U.S. chairmanship. And so as a lot of you know, there's been a fair number of meetings in Alaska because of this, and there's going to be quite a few more, including the ministerial meeting that'll take place in Fairbanks next spring that will culminate the U.S. chairmanship. So at the top of the Arctic Council is the ministers, and these are the ministers of foreign affairs of the Arctic countries. And so for our purposes, our Minister of Foreign Affairs is actually Secretary of State, so that's currently John Kerry. And they form the top layer of the Arctic Council. Then the managers of the Arctic Council are the senior Arctic officials, and they tend to be sort of medium-level diplomats that work within the the foreign affairs ministries of their countries. Right now, during this U.S. chairmanship, there are 3 special task forces that are working, and they exist just for these 2 years of the U.S. chairmanship. So you see there's one on Arctic Marine cooperation, one on scientific cooperation, and one on telecommunications infrastructure. And then below that, there are 6 working groups that follow broadly thematic lines. And these working groups always exist within the Arctic Council. Some of them have existed before the Arctic Council, and so they were working groups that were sort of absorbed into the Arctic Council as part of their work plan. And so for instance, protection of the Arctic marine environment came obviously as sort of the Marine Working Group, Marine Affairs. Conservation of Arctic flora and fauna is the Biodiversity Working Group. EPPR is all about emergency preparedness and response, and on and on. The Sustainable Development Working Group is really where a lot of the human aspect of the Arctic comes in. So language, culture, social issues are all covered under the Sustainable Development Working Group. So I sort of, this flowchart shows the structure of the Arctic Council, but it doesn't really show who's in it. And so I sort of added the permanent participants as a box up here by the ministers because I sort of think of them that way. And if you say, well, where do the PPs really fit in all of this? Well, where they fit in, and if you go to the next slide, is they really fit in everywhere, absolutely everywhere. The permanent participants, if you think of all of these things as tables, the permanent participants sit at each and every one of these tables. And this is only a sort of a broad sort of look at the Arctic Council, because if you drill down, you find that within each of these boxes, there's numerous initiatives. And so, for instance, amongst the 6 working groups right now, there's roughly between 80 and 90 active projects going on. And so that is a lot of activity, a lot of initiatives, a lot of work to keep track of. And so it's a lot for any organization, but for a small organization like AIA, we work really hard to keep up with as much of this as we possibly can. And of course, we have to prioritize. Some things are more important than others. So another thing that you should look at when you look at these boxes is if you look at the bottom left box, that's the EPPR box, Emergency Prevention, Preparedness, and Response, which is a priority working group for AIA. Well, those boxes represent people that are involved with these activities. And one of those people is sitting on that stage right now. Karen Pletnikoff is AIA's representative for EPPR. And so Karen, I'm sure, could answer some questions if you have them later about what all of this work really implies and what I'm talking about in terms of how we do all this and how we try to, again, try to manage as much of it as we possibly can. Right now, as I mentioned, we're in the U.S. chairmanship, and typically each country's chairmanship involves some thematic areas that they want to concentrate on. So now, during this period of the U.S. chairmanship, there are 3 thematic areas that the U.S. has chosen. One is addressing the impacts of climate change, and I'm going to talk quite a bit more about that as I move through the presentation. The second is stewardship of the Arctic Ocean, and there's a lot of work going on about how to manage the Arctic Ocean in terms of both knowledge, but also in terms of activities. And a big part of that is the international or high seas areas of the Arctic Ocean. How should the Arctic states be involved in the management of those areas? And then the third thematic area is improved economic and living conditions. And there's a lot of initiatives, and some of you are probably hearing about during the Aleutian Life Conference, that are related to things like fresh water and sanitation and housing and renewable energy, and a lot of areas that are of importance to peoples of the Arctic in order to really improve and maintain living conditions in the face of change. And so a thread that runs through all of this, particularly in the last couple of years and really in the couple of years prior, is resilience and adaptation, because it's really well recognized that we're facing a really unprecedented scope and volume of change in the Arctic right now. And so it's easy to get resilience and adaptation confused, but there's an important difference. And I suspect you've been hearing a lot about these two things, and you're probably well aware of the definitions. But I like to think of resilience as the ability of the system to bounce back and thrive after disturbances. So in other words, the resources that the system has in order to do that. And then adaptation is the change itself, the things you do that you respond to changes that happen, and those responses moderate these disruptions and take advantage of opportunities that exist to do that. So these two things are vitally important in a system that's undergoing a rapid change, and that is where we find ourselves in the Arctic right now. And so the Arctic Council, if we move forward to the next slide, has two really important initiatives that are going to be deliverables for the U.S. chairmanship when it concludes in May of 2017. One is the Arctic Resilience Assessment and Framework. And so the main areas and the main goals of the Arctic Resilience Assessment and then the framework that it will produce is that it builds on the strength of the Arctic Council, and there's a lot of important work and structures within the Arctic Council that already exist, so those wheels do not need to be reinvented, they need to be built on. Now, another thing that we're particularly appreciative of is a very strong recognition on the value of Indigenous knowledge and what that brings to all of this, and that in reality, you cannot have a complete picture of what is happening in the Arctic without the inclusion of Indigenous knowledge, and there's a lot of work going on to try to figure out better ways to include Indigenous knowledge in all of the Arctic Council's work. Next is looking at commitments that already exist, and so there's a lot of things that are going on at the global, regional, and national levels about resilience and how to maximize it. And so looking at those commitments and building on those is also really, really important, as is really involving everybody in this effort. If you don't have everybody sitting at the table working on this, if you're leaving out certain voices, you're not, again, getting the complete picture, and you're not going to come to a solution that is optimal for everybody. So you have to have all the stakeholders involved. And that means empowering local communities, because one of the problems, of course, is that often communities simply don't have the resources to be involved in all of this work. And without empowering communities to do that, again, you're missing a part of the picture that's vitally important. Now, another thing is to look for opportunities to address risk together. So in other words, are there activities you could be undertaking that address multiple risks simultaneously? And by doing that, you likely can reap some co-benefits. And then you have to consider the risks that are happening and the resilience required at all time scales. So in other words, you got to look in the short term. What are the short-term sort of low-hanging fruit things we can do? But also, what do we need to do to optimize so finally, of course, is proactive action. And so in other words, we have to look what we can do right away. And one of the things that's been pretty well documented is that the cost of dealing with, for instance, the effects of climate change, it goes up geometrically. So things you do now to address the effects of climate change will be much, much cheaper than things you'll do 20 years down the line, because you'll be dealing with a much bigger, much more acute problem as time progresses. And so small steps you can take now to adjust course will be really, really efficient and also will maximize resources. If you wait, it's just going to get worse and worse. And so proactive action is really important, and proactive action requires that you have all the information you possibly can to make these decisions. So the Arctic Resilience Assessment and Framework is going to be a very important deliverable, and our hope is, and what we're working towards, is that this is a valuable deliverable for people on the ground in communities. It's something that they can use to help them assess their resilience and maximize it. Now, another project that's really important and has been multiple years in the making. We've been involved with this project for at least the last 5 years, and the seeds of it really started before then. And this is a project called Adaptation Actions for a Changing Arctic that looks more specifically at adaptation and how that functions. And so this is being divided into 3 regional reports. And the one that we're involved with, and of course the most interested in, is the Bering-Chukchi-Beaufort report. There's another one that deals with Davis Strait and Baffin Bay between the east coast of Canada and Greenland. And then there's one for the Barents Sea as well that looks at Europe and Russia. And so the idea behind this is to look at the current environment of each of these three regions and living conditions as well, and use that sort of baseline to understand how life is changing, and also to try to project what's going to happen to the environment, what's going to happen to economic systems and social systems as we move forward into this time of change. And so the idea behind it, of course, is to be able to better prepare what's going to happen. And so there's been some identified priority areas, particularly for what we call the BCB region. So one of those is food security and cultural cohesion. So those are both vitally important for culture, or for indigenous peoples, and it's recognized that the proportion of indigenous peoples in the Arctic is quite high, and so food security and cultural cohesion are really important. But also, what is really important is sustainable economic activities, because if you don't have an economy, it's very difficult for a community to be able to adapt. And so, but in looking at the definition of economic activities, that definition is really broad. So that includes things you might traditionally think of, like, for instance, the seafood industry or tourism. But it also includes things like subsistence and other things that really contribute to the economy of a community in the broadest sense. And so the idea is to really cover that, all of that. And so there's a lot of challenges that communities and peoples are facing in the North. And some of those things include rate and magnitude of change. I mean, the rate and magnitude is startling, and it's only going to get worse. And in trying to deal with that, we really don't have enough information. We lack climate, environmental, and other information to deal with it. And so we really need to step up the amount of information gathering that's happening. And I'm going to talk about how we all fit into that here in just a second. And then really, what are the tools we have? Using the right tools and developing new ones is going to be really, really important. And again, we're all going to play a role in that. And it's important that we do play that role. And so the way forward for the report that the report is going to discuss is a focus on education, because it's well documented that education is a key factor in adaptive capacity for communities. Also, prioritization, so in other words, focusing on particular sectors so that you target the resources effectively. Again, development of tools and their dissemination is super important, because we're going to need new tools. And also, looking at ways to better share information and resources. So what are the networks that exist? What are the ones we don't have that we need to build? And identifying those and working to establish them is going to be super important. So when this report comes out, again, we're really working hard to try to make sure that it's something that's going to be valuable at the ground level to communities. And we're hopeful that this thing's going to make a splash and sort of change people's perceptions of what adaptation means and what we need to effectively implement it. So that brings me to the next slide that I want to talk about, and I know you're going to have a session on this shortly, so I'll just be very brief and just say that communities have a very, very, very important role to play in this, and the value of that is being better recognized all the time. And so community-based observation networks, or CBONs as we sometimes call them, are vitally important. And I love this little graphic here that was actually developed by Lil Alessa and Andy Kliske that shows really these multiple levels of data gathering and observations. And at the base of this upside-down pyramid is people on the ground. I mean, without people on the ground, you're just simply not getting all the information, and you're not able to ground truth information either. So people's involvement is super important, and we know that because people can provide real-time observations in a cultural context, and that is vitally important. And it's also capacity building for communities, and by building community capacity, you can enhance security and safety. Communities can be first responders, and that, in my mind, is super important, because with a small investment of resources, communities can play a role in search and rescue, in oil spill tracking and cleanup, and a variety of things that happen because of these changes we're experiencing due to the changing climate. So enhancing the role of communities as first responders is a big part of this. But it's also a part of feeding into these data streams that are happening at multiple levels. And so, we've got satellite data and buoy data and observational data from researchers and all these things that are going into these systems. Well, communities can contribute to those data streams, and making community information compatible with all of this other data is really important. And when it is, it tells a broader picture. Now, involving communities, as I mentioned, it really brings about a better understanding of resources and resource security, and it has it's beneficial for everybody. It's beneficial at the community level. It's beneficial for research. It's beneficial for government to have all this information, and so it really it's a win for everybody when communities are involved. And I know you're going to hear a lot more about that. So I'll just mention a few things. Two of the ones that AIA is currently involved with is the Arctic Domain Awareness Center, or ADAC, where we're helping to manage some community observers that feed information into the ADAC system. A lot of you are probably aware of our Bering Sea Subnetwork project that happened from 2006 to 2011. Well, the spin-off of BSSN is a project called CONUS, Community Observation Network for Adaptation and Security, where BSSN looked pretty specifically at subsistence. CONUS looks more broadly at adaptive capacity. So in other words, what are the factors in a community that allow the community to adapt? And so that information is gathered by the communities themselves. The important features are determined by the communities, and really the final products are the communities are very heavily involved in influencing. And again, we want this to be something that's useful for communities. And you're going to hear a lot more about really interesting stuff like Bering Watch and the LEO network and Karen and Aaron's initiatives and others. And so I won't go into those because you're going to hear a lot about them very soon. But just to say that all of this really comes together with people. And so involvement of people is critically important, and that's true for AIA at the Arctic Council level. It's true up and down the chain. And so if you have questions about the Arctic Council, if you have questions about the work we're doing there and how to get involved in it, please contact us. We're a little office. We're super busy. If we don't answer you the first time, try again, because we want to get to everybody and see what role everybody can potentially play in all this. Because really, AIA serves as a sort of a conduit. It's our job to bring information from the communities to the Arctic Council so that they consider that information when they're making decisions. And just as important is that we take these products that the Arctic Council develops and bring them back to communities as well. So that's our job, is to have information flowing both ways. And resilience and adaptation, super important and key for all of these things that are happening as we move forward. And so the last slide is just me saying thank you to everybody for your patience. Sorry, again, I couldn't be there myself. But we're always available by email or on the phone. And Karen, I'm sure, would be happy to answer any questions about the work she's doing in the Arctic Council. So I'll just say thanks very much, and I hope to make it next time. Thank you.